On October 26, 2022, the Ridgeville Housing Authority finally reckons with the Prospect Ridge expansion proposal. Present are Chairman David Goldenberg and members Kevin Brown, Whit Campbell, Deborah Francis Cheney, Sharon Kent, Lori Mazzola, and Kent Rohr. Reality finally sinks in as Kent Rohr assesses the likelihood that Prospect Ridge can ever overcome so many obstacles, including the grant application's false promise of housing authority participation, a hard-to-break state dedication agreement restricting the land for recreation and open space purposes, planning and zoning's opposition to standalone low-income housing they consider slums, and very passionate and vocal public opposition. But instead of honorably returning unspent grant funding to the state, they agree to embroil First Selectman Rudy Marconi in a shameless bait-and-switch scheme to divert the remaining funds to some other ill-defined, low-income housing chicanery. Here are excerpts of that lengthy and delusional discussion and its unsavory conclusion.
I on a couple of things. I personally believe, my personal opinion, that the odds of us actually doing something at Prospect Ridge are probably low. However, I don't think it's zero, and I also believe that some of what the study was intended to do would help us understand things about impact of a more substantial affordable housing development in Ridgefield, whether it be at Prospect Ridge or whether it be north on Route 7, whether it be in Branchfield, wherever it might be. I believe that we could learn something from a broader study that helped us to understand impacts on traffic, schools, sewers, other infrastructure kind of things, to understand what impacts would be. I think we should ask the state to allow us to broaden the scope of a development, not just thinking about Prospect Ridge, thinking about conceivably other owned town properties or potentially other private properties.
What Kent is suggesting, if I can sum up and tell me if I'm wrong, is that instead of focusing simply on Prospect Ridge,
Right.
we ask the state if we can expand the scope to look for additional suitable properties in town to explore, given the fact that Prospect Ridge is going to be an uphill process all the way.
That, you know, I would make a motion that we approach the state, that for the grant money, that we request that they allow us to expand the exploration of the feasibility study to properties beyond Prospect Ridge, properties located in Ridgefield beyond Prospect Ridge. That we approach the Board of Selectmen with a request that the existing funding, we approach the state to ask them to allow us to expand that feasibility study to consider other, to help us determine what other viable properties might exist in Ridgefield. Do we have a second on the motion?
Oh, so I'm sorry.
Section.
Okay, Lori.
So my comment is I'm generally in favor of this idea. I think the open question in my mind is that approaching, and I forget the gentleman's name that helped us with the original site suitability surveys, you know, a firm that can do that may not be the firm that would
Absolutely.
address an inventory of
Nope.
the town. So the question is, in my mind, is there someone who can do that for us?
Well, that's probably something we would have to do ourselves.
My practical point for wanting to do with it is, I look at Prospect Ridge and I say, well, it's 13 acres, everything I know about it says, could it be built on? Yes. Is it likely that we will ever do that in my lifetime? No. All I'm saying is, you know, many of the questions that we want to have answered, right? are, what are our impacts to infrastructure? What are our impacts to sewer, traffic, everything else? So we can answer some of those questions a bit more generically.
I would think it would be hard for us to determine those kind of things without a specific site, because one site
Well,
could
but
create
you know,
an
maybe,
issue, another
I
site
don't,
can't.
I don't know,
you know?
I'm not sure either, and
Yeah.
maybe to some degree it would be, but I think there's differences within the, you know, the traditional downtown area that's served by sewers, those that aren't. I mean, I think there are some parameters, right? Is it viable in the Branchville area? Is it viable in any place within the, you know, the downtown area? Are there other areas off Route 35 or whatever that may be viable? We're simply asking them to allow us to expand the aperture to use this grant for evaluation of properties beyond Prospect Ridge. The first thing we're really asking is just to be able to approach the state, to open up the aperture, to use these funds more broadly than originally defined, and to make sure we remove this notion that says whatever it is must be managed by the Ridgefield Housing Authority. Those are the two things that I would want accomplished. I think it would be, I don't think it would be worthwhile to spend it, because right now it's targeted for only evaluating this kind of impacts on Prospect Ridge. And I think, you know, there are enough, as I started out by saying this, I'm keep going back, there are enough things about Prospect
Right.
Ridge that I don't think make it a highly likely candidate, right? But that doesn't mean that I think we should then forego all the money and not try to figure out if there isn't a proposal. Maybe it's lesser size, maybe it's 25, maybe it's 3 different parcels instead of 1, and the state would be open to allowing us to do that and use funding to do a more thorough feasibility study on whatever that might be. But it's a narrowing process, right? The first thing we've got to do is say, are they willing to let us change the scope? And then as we get that awareness, then we've got to start to narrow it down, including probably saying, here's the parameters under which we would want properties evaluated.
Just a question, because when it comes to the money, I get cheap on that. So if the money that hasn't been used, okay, at some point, we can use that, let's say they say no,
Okay?
okay? Where does that money go? And
Still use it for Prospect Ridge?
Just never
just
gets,
for Prospect
just
Ridge?
never gets used.
No, just for Prospect Ridge.
Right, it could be used for private, so we could, I mean, in theory, and I would not do this, we have the authority right now, because the Board of Selectmen agreed to allow us to spend those funds for an evaluation of Prospect Ridge, right? I don't want to do that. I don't think that's worthwhile spending of our money. I want the aperture opened. Put it this way, I don't think when we consider other properties and expanding the aperture, I don't think we, by definition, exclude Prospect Ridge, but I don't think we make it the only and sole focus, because I think it has enough issues that it's not likely to proceed. But I do think we can learn about a feasibility study. I think we can learn more things about impact to schools and infrastructure and sewer, because we've conjectured one way or another. There is or isn't sewer capacity. I don't know. But, you know, is this going to be a major impact to schools? I don't know. But I mean, we could start to get that. Now, maybe the other, you know, suggestion was, and we said it a little earlier, maybe we tune it more towards a mix of senior housing. That could go back, you know, to the discussion as well. I think the way it's positioned now, and I don't think the grant had anything to do with that, but the way the concept came by, I don't know if it was like, you know, a third, wasn't it, you know, so.
Yeah, it was just hypothetical.
It was a straw
That's
man.
right, yeah.
Right, but I mean, and maybe the straw man is different. Maybe it's, you know, it's geared more towards, you know, or maybe we ask as part of the study to say, where do you think the needs are? Because first we need to understand if the state would even be flexible enough to do it. So that's what I'm really trying to get through first. So I would, you know, my motion stands as it was, I mean, I understand there certainly are different opinions. But we're not moving together with the feasibility study because we want the nature of the feasibility study changed, and we want to approach the Board of Selectmen to make sure they're willing to let us do that so we can have
That's
the
the
discussion.
proposal.
I personally think the bigger question is, will the state allow us to expand the scope? Once they do, and before we would proceed with letting any kind of funding go out, we would narrow the scope of saying, here's what it is we want you to look at. I agree we'd have to go there, but I think if we take that step first, without even knowing if we would have the ability to do that, we're gonna be chasing our tail. I just think
So you're suggesting go to Board of Selectmen, go to the state,
right.
and then do the work of narrowing it down.
Narrowing it down before we would
Before engaging.
before we would engage anyone or actually release any funds.
Why, here's an idea. Why don't we consider in contacting the state informally, calling the appropriate person or an email or whatever and asking, would you be receptive to a formal request to expand or change the scope of this grant money? We're not sure we're not confident that we'll be able to continue to use the 47,000. We think we could potentially put it to good use elsewhere in town. You know, would you be receptive to that? If they say, no, tough luck, the grant is written and it's set in stone, and either you use the money or you get it back, then all of this is moot.
Sure, but that's what we're talking about.
No,
We need to go to the Board of
Board of
Selectmen
Selectmen.
before we go to the state.
We
That's
can
what we're
formally
saying.
That's what-
contact the state and ask them if they would be receptive to a request
Right.
that we're not making.
We don't want to work behind the Board of Selectmen's back.
Okay.
That's the point. I mean, I understand you, but that's the bottom line.
Looking for,
Well-
certainly.
Rudy can make that call to the state.
Yeah.
Why don't we ask Rudy to make
Yeah.
it? And then if we get an answer back that says, no, the state wouldn't consider it, then all of this is moot. If Rudy
Right.
says, yes, they would consider it, then it puts the ball back in our court to decide how do we want to make that proposal and with
But
what
either
level
way,
of
we
specificity.
we approach the Board of Selectmen.
Yeah, I would ask Rudy to ask.
Before we ask the Board of Selectmen.
Correct.
So we go to the state to ask them if it's okay, ask them
No,
if
no,
we should go to the
no.
Board of Selectmen,
No,
then ask them
Rudy,
if we should
ask
go to the
Rudy.
state.
Ask Rudy.
call.
Say, dear Miss Mascara, I think is her name, would will the state, is it possible to change the scope of the grant? And if so, would you consider a request if we make one?
Would you accept an amendment to your motion to that effect?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm fine with
Okay,
that.
so
Good compromise.
let's look at the motion now. So the motion is to ask Rudy to contact the state to determine their flexibility, then to go to the Board of Selectmen to get permission to do it, then officially go to the state and ask them to
Exactly.
expand the scope.
Exactly.
Okay. Any other discussion? There being none, we'll vote. All in favor indicate by raising your hand. All opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so it's unanimous.
Clerk Carr, 62 Prospect Ridge. A lot of discussion this evening about the grant. I have a copy of the grant application, which apparently you're aware did indicate that the Housing Authority would develop and operate, manage this facility at Prospect Ridge, which is, I think, one of the concerns that I've expressed numerous times. So
You have.
it's not new. I am encouraged by your discussion tonight. I mean, I think it's finally getting through to you that Prospect Ridge is not a good location, but it's really not a location that you could ever use. The state dedication would prevent you from using portions of it that you would encroach upon. The Housing Authority has never, ever said they want additional inventory, even though that was put into the application. And if they needed inventory, I think they would have said so. I think they're having trouble keeping what inventory they have occupied. So I know I've seen your lists, about how many people are on the list. But I think one of the problems that the Housing Authority has is they are not confident that if you added 70 units, that they'd be able to keep them filled. And I think it's one of the reasons that you're not having them come here and say, oh yeah. I mean, you've had all these public hearings. I think it was one person from the Housing Authority and the resident director who did make a comment, but he certainly didn't comment about wanting these. But the thing is this has all been pushed kind of downhill to people like you who are working very hard to follow the state mandate, which is a ridiculous mandate. You're kind of sent on a fool's errand. And I sort of empathize with you in that respect. And I know some of you really think it's a good thing, but I think some of you are beginning to realize that you really have been sent on an errand that's not very productive. So I appreciate the time you put into this. Tonight was an interesting discussion. I think Mr. Rohr has got some suggestions that'll move you ahead. I would be shocked if the state allows you to bait and switch at this point. So thank you. After so much mendacity in this grant application, why should the state trust this committee and Ridgefield again? This proposal that was ill-conceived, fatally flawed, and intellectually dishonest from its inception. Only one selectman, Bob Hebert, had the depth of knowledge as a former chairman of the Housing Authority with the presence of mind to vote no. At the very least, it appears Ridgefield has dodged the bullet of tearing down Paradise and building a parking lot. The question remains, will Ridgefield compound the scandal by trying to keep the grant money obtained in this shameless bait and switch, or will it fess up and return the state's unused funding, demonstrate good faith, and salvage Ridgefield's reputation before the Housing and Urban Development Inspector General gets wind of it? And has the time come at long last to permanently terminate the Affordable Housing Committee and retire David Goldenberg to end decades of nonsense once and for all?